This is Adam Olsen, Embark's Accounting Advisory National Practice Leader, and we're coming back at you on another episode of Accounting Matters, recapping another segment of the 2022 AICPA Conference on current SEC and PCAOB developments. I'm welcoming back to the podcast Chase Anderson, our Capital Markets Practice Leader, to join me in today's conversation, really centered around one of the trending topics that we heard at the conference itself, which was centered around cybersecurity, which really went hand in hand with the recent kind of proposal that the SEC pulled out earlier in 2022 around cybersecurity disclosure. So Chase, welcome back to the podcast.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks, Adam. I think you left out, I'm also the Phoenix market president.
That's true.
We'll let that slide.
Yeah, well, I think of you as Cap Markets leader. He's also the recently appointed Phoenix market president as well at Embark. So pulling double duty here, but nonetheless has a lot of great insight to share on today's topic as well. So
yeah, great to be here.
Excited to have you join.
Yeah, thrilled to be back. And I think one of the highlights from the conference, I think we're going to talk about too, was the fan base of Accounting Matters that showed up to the booth on Monday, specifically asking for your insights and your time, and I think your signature too, if I'm not mistaken. So,
yeah, the fan base is growing, I suppose, but yeah, no, it was great to interact with people that have been listening to the podcast or had heard things, and just kind of, meeting them, as well as other people that stopped by. Embark attending in person this year was, I think, a great opportunity for us to get to know a lot of folks, and definitely we're looking forward to being back next year.
Yeah, this was my first time at that conference, and so coming from the West Coast, Arizona, historically I never was offered the opportunity to fly out there and attend it, and so seeing that in person, that conference, and just the size of it, I think I told you when we were there, it felt like the Super Bowl of conferences for accountants, because it was great. You had all of the top people of those organizations giving their insight, talking amongst the crowd, talking amongst the participants after their sessions. And it was great. It was great to be able to talk to them as people and not just these like authoritative body figures that, being in Phoenix and in California, it's like, I get to see the words on paper of like, this is the authoritative now stance. It was great to actually hear them as people talk and give their insight, obviously with disclaimers, which was also pretty cool to hear, just everybody disclaim everything away from the views. But yeah, it was a great conference. It was fascinating too, Adam, with the whole barricaded situation that we had there. For the listeners, there was a U.S. Africa summit, and everything was shut down. Roads, there was National Guard, there was riot. What do you call that? Sidewalk riot gear. So nobody really left the conference because it was just such a bizarre setting. But nonetheless, inside the conference, it was great, and the material was great, and the 3 days flew by.
Accounting and reporting must go on, I guess, is the message there, and it did. And like you said, I think it was 3 days of great content, and the ability to interact and meet with so many people. So. But I know today we're going to chat a bit about just cybersecurity, and cybersecurity itself. They did have a dedicated panel specific to cybersecurity, which a lot of interesting insights that came from there. And I think it makes sense that this was a topic that they brought up, even absent the SEC proposed rule. I think it still would have been a relevant topic to have, because if you just think about businesses today, investors, everyone's at the risk of like cybersecurity breaches, right? It's always, you hear about them in the news from time to time, and hacks and breaches are just like, it's almost like it's a commonplace threat that people have to deal with. So there were a lot of good insights, I think, shared through the panel discussion there. And they tended to focus a bit more, obviously, because it is accounting and reporting, on the disclosure aspects of cybersecurity risks and policies, and then any incidents as well. So that, I thought that, that's where the conversation definitely centered around. It also ties in, I think, with the larger theme, and we've talked about this actually on some of the other special episodes we've done, is, if you step back from the individual panels and just think about the conference as a whole, the messaging was all around like better financial information for investors, being transparent and putting into your financial statements or your filings, information that investors are needing and wanting and looking for. And so, cyber threats are no different than any other, related type disclosure items that they highlighted at the conference itself.
Yeah, a couple of those themes too were just timely disclosures,
Sure.
accurate disclosures, and then materiality, which in the context of cyber, the biggest takeaway from that and from what I was hearing was, we're historically used to thinking about materiality as just pure dollars when we've audited financial statements or helped clients through preparing disclosures or technical accounting conclusions. But for cyber, you could have an incident that the theme that the SEC was hammering on was, could it be material? And
Right.
so the whole could be, it's like, wow, that is a whole different qualitative set of assessments that you need to think through of, legal exposure, brand exposure, customer vendor exposure of how significant is the damage going to be from something that might seem insignificant to you today, just in terms of the pure dollars of that breach. So
Yeah.
the could be was like,
Yeah, I was gonna say they had folks from the SEC's enforcement division speak on this as well. And, they really were hammering in that materiality. It's like you said, it's not just that quantitative thing, it's qualitative as well. So you need to think about that what if, or even just think about like who the attack was against. If they're hacking into your executive group, is that more risky than if they just hack some routine lower level employees, computer or something? So there's different levels to think through it. And I think the SEC was also trying to lay in through their enforcement discussion is, they've levied penalties against companies that haven't put, sufficient disclosures that had a breach, really explaining like the impacts and quantifying the impacts of those breaches timely in their filings as well. So it's definitely something they're for sure focused on. And it makes sense that they're trending that way with more explicit rules, but maybe just to like set the stage. And I know they did this a bit in there as well. Chase, kind of what were your takeaways as they kind of walk through just historically?
My big takeaway was just how we got to where we are today. And so Pedro Cordero, the head of Cyber Academy at the FBI, did a great job of kind of laying the landscape here. And so the first thing was just, the internet's only 40 years old. And that's not that much time to be as complex as businesses today. And so much has changed over time and risks change. And you think about just a business, your board, and just the importance of having people in the right seat, board members that truly know cybersecurity. And I don't know if that was necessarily been a focus of a lot of companies to date. I think historically we looked at boards from just how do you run a business? How do you grow customer base? How do you, increase profitability? But now there's just so much risk and exposure behind data. I think about what you and I are doing right now. And if somebody were to hack our firm and shut us down, like we would just stop. Like, I don't even know what we would do to get our business going. And so every business is at risk of this. And it's the SEC is focused on, what are people doing? This is such an important area that to date probably hasn't gotten the attention that it deserves, just for how pervasive it is. And some other things that Pedro was talking big picture was, I think in 2020, he mentioned that there was about 40,000 8Ks filed, and there was about 4,000 filers. Of all of those filers and everything we hear about cybersecurity in the news, all the breaches, all the risks, there was approximately 40 8Ks that actually talked about cybersecurity material breaches. And when you step back and think about just 40, that seems awfully light, especially when you think about what you and I were just talking about in the context of materiality. People are getting hit every day by cyber attacks or attempted cyber attacks, and some of those are successful. And people need to be made aware of that. The investors would like to know really like what's happening behind the scenes, and could this impact my investment?
Yeah, and he was pretty I think he characterized it. He's basically like, cybersecurity risk is going to be the greatest threat for businesses like in our century. Like he was really laying down like, this is universal. And yet when you do look at just companies kind of talking about that risk or talking about how they're trying to mitigate that risk or what policy. It's, you know, a lot of it's very boilerplate or very light, and really I think it just led into explaining more or less why the SEC prescribed in their proposed rule just more guidance and more regulation about what will be required. And then it'll also just allow investors also to kind of just look between business to business and have more comparability around some of the cybersecurity disclosures, to really help weigh the risk of their investments with certain companies and understand what companies are doing to help protect themselves and protect the investors of their company as well.
Mhm.
I think, just to maybe to level set too, just for listeners who maybe weren't aware, like prior to this proposed rule, there really is no specific like requirements and regulation, SK or SX that explicitly refers to like cybersecurity risks or incidents. So largely when the SEC is kind of levying enforcement actions, it's by applying existing requirements that are just more general disclosure obligations around risks and things like that, that they're really kind of pointing to people today when there's issues with whether or not people are providing enough information. But this proposed rule for sure will help, just make it more clear, not have this gray area about people having to interpret existing disclosure obligation guidance when relating it to cybersecurity when they actually have a specific rule. So I think that's helpful maybe for some people to understand that maybe just don't like live and breathe in this space, is that there is an explicit guidance today, which may also be leading to why we see such a little like specific disclosure on the topic itself.
Yeah, and just so I actually found a bullet definition that I found was just very helpful. Like when there is no explicit requirement, I thought my takeaway, and I'd love to hear yours, Adam, it was, this is what I took away from a proposed rule, is the commission considers omitted information to be material if there is a substantial likelihood that a reasonable investor would consider the information important to making an investment decision, or that disclosure of the omitted information would have been viewed by a reasonable investor as having significantly altered the total mix of information available. And so
Yeah,
like
and
that's
basically
like
the
you just
definition
take
of
you take a step back.
materiality, right, from the
Yeah.
Supreme Court rulings. And so like that's obviously used universally as it relates to disclosure obligations. So for sure, like, if you're wrestling whether or not something, step back and think about that. And that's where basically, we had an earlier discussion around materiality. It's not just a quantitative number. So maybe the dollar impact isn't that significant, but like qualitatively, when you start thinking about things and you start applying that definition that you just laid out, like, does it make sense to include a little more color in the filings around whatever event or incident occurred?
Yeah, I mean, we have all of these stacks of regulation. You kind of take a step back and just think through like a basic principle of what we're trying to apply here, and it applies to cyber. If we get back to the only the 48Ks, and it's like, okay, yeah, clearly this is more pervasive and it's on the SEC's radar.
Yeah.
And it's gonna be here to stay. It's only gonna get more complex. I think about self-driving cars and just how if somebody were to hack that, you could have thousands of self-driving cars that are just going crazy out in the streets. And so, but it's the intangible that we're not used to kind of feeling. Just this is all happening inside of computers.
I thought another interesting point, and this was not in the cyber panel, but it related to cyber. It was during when the SEC OCA panel presented. They were just more or less paralleling just recommendations and things for people to recognize. And it was during when they were talking about kind of like a control deficiency. So ICFR deficiencies that they'd seen, throughout different companies, and just remembering people to identify those and try to do, an understanding of what those deficiencies are when things go wrong. And they actually made a parallel between, like, if you got a cybersecurity breach as an example, like, you need to step back and look at your current processes, policies, procedures around cybersecurity. So be it that you have good processes, controls, and procedures around it, and try to figure out like what failed, because inherently a breach, a threat, whatever, it's no different than a financial statement error in a way, so you got to identify somewhere in your process as well where that deficiency lies. And so just trying to make that like parallel between the two. I thought that was an interesting point that they had as well. That wasn't specific to the panel on cybersecurity.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the other things that Pedro mentioned too is just shortage of cyber talent
Yep.
and people specific behind that. And so you think about the individuals like management and sub-management, but also board of directors, and really looking back at the mix of the competencies on the board and making sure that you've got somebody that's an expert in financial accounting, but also cyber, just because it's so important to how businesses operate. So I thought that
Right.
was a pretty good little just tidbit to think about for our clients and businesses.
Yeah, and you see a lot of organizations, especially larger organizations, they even have roles specific to that, right? They'll have chief technology officers or chief information officers or some similar title that, generally equates to somebody at the upper levels or executive levels of management that hopefully can bring that expertise. But there's a lot of companies out there that don't, and it begs the question, like, especially as this becomes a larger threat, like, is that prudent, or should that really be a focus as companies are thinking about their board composition or upper level management hires and things of the nature? So, no, I thought that was a good point as well. I know they didn't talk a ton about the proposed rule itself during the panel discussion, but maybe just to like wrap up our conversation today, Chase, is there like a 20-second summary hit on that? I
Yeah, I
will
can.
maybe I'll
Yeah,
pause on and say, like, once the final rule comes out, which I expect at some point in early 2023, we'll probably come back to the podcast and do a kind of a full-fledged more walkthrough of the rule and kind of explain more of the specifics. But just high level, like,
yeah.
what does this rule looking to achieve, and kind of what are maybe some of the main points of the rule?
They are looking for disclosures around board members with cybersecurity expertise. So that's on the horizon. Item 1.05 for 8K, disclosing material incidents, and that's material being like we talked about the relative mix of information that could be material to the company. The Form 8K would include items such as when the incident was discovered and whether it is still ongoing, a brief description of the nature and scope of the incident, whether any data was stolen, altered, accessed, or used for any other unauthorized purposes, the effect of the incident on the registrant's operations, whether the registrant has remediated or is currently remediating the incident. Those are some of the big ones. And so I think what's also key is the SEC is not asking people to disclose too much information to open themselves up to more risk, right? That's not the intent of this. The intent is just to provide investors information so they can kind of assess in the total mix what could be material for their investment decisions based on the business. So
Yeah, and I'll say, like, all those like disclosure requirements, I mean, they really relate to like incident disclosures, right? So they're timely disclosures that you expect when an incident has occurred, and then, like, in tandem to that in the rule, there's also just kind of your typical annual disclosures, but they're very specific to cybersecurity in this new proposed rule. And so it's specific disclosures on policies and procedures, specific disclosures on management's role and kind of managing cybersecurity risk and implementing those policies and procedures and strategies. And then there's also specific disclosures as well around just kind of the oversight of the board's oversight as it relates to cybersecurity. So very pointed things that you'd also kind of expect as kind of annual policy type procedure disclosures in your filings as well, in addition to all those timely disclosures that you talked about. So cool. I think that's a good place to put a pin in this and wrap it up for today. Chase, appreciate you sharing.
I'm glad I keep getting invited back. So I think I must be doing something okay. So I appreciate it, Adam.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And again, thanks to our listeners for tuning into this episode. And just a preview for our next episode is another trending topic that we heard at the conference, and that was around crypto assets and digital assets and the like. So a lot of good content there. So definitely come back and check that out on our next part of our special series. And until then, everyone, have a good day, and thanks for listening.